Earlier today, JD raised a great question in his presentation. Are we taking full advantage of the technologies and security controls we have today? And from what I'm seeing from a lot of the assessments that we do at Dragos, the answer is no. And in my presentation today, I'll be talking about 5 simple things that companies with ICS security programs can do during the slowdown period without access to vendors or travel to come out of this whole situation stronger than ever. Of course, these things alone that I'm talking about today do not make an ICS cybersecurity program. They do enable incident response. They do enable threat hunting. And when I have an ICS architecture assessment or a penetration test or ICS red team in your environment, that team can spend their time and energy focusing on the more interesting issues and problems rather than burning time and documenting the same old findings that they see everywhere. And as a result, you'll get better return on investment from these types of services. And furthermore, if an ICS targeting adversary breaches your network, these 5 things will make them work harder. It will make them sweat and have a bad day in general. It will make them do things outside of their comfort zone and increase their chances of getting caught or detected. And we want the adversary to have a bad day. We want them to have to explain to their supervisor why things are taking longer to break into the target network than they expected. And we want them to lay in the bed, staring at their ceiling, questioning their life choices that made them target infrastructure that puts their fellow humans' lives at risk. So let's jump into it. Next slide, please. So, oh, there we go. Perfect. So really this presentation is based off a lot of the recommendations we have from some of the most common findings that we see when we're doing industrial penetration tests for our customer sites. And these findings are really universal across verticals. So we see the same findings in oil and gas. We see the same findings in energy, and we see the same findings in manufacturing. And they're all very common. We're seeing limited or no visibility into the ICS OT network. When we're doing these assessments, the blue team is often unable to detect us or see that we're there. There's a lack of separation often between the IT and OT user management. Organizations are often sharing credentials across multiple machines, and once you get a hold of those, you're able to kind of have free will of the network. We often see routable network connections into the operational environment, which is intentional in most cases. Most people, they need access to that data. They need it in their IT environment so they can run their business. And a lot of the adversaries we see have been able to find direct routes into the ICS networks from the internet. So next slide, please. So what I'm proposing is a rapid self-check, doing some of these activities on a regular basis to help shore up your cybersecurity program. A lot of these things are low cost or easy to do, and they can be done without the need for any support from a vendor or third party. And it really helps organizations to take ownership of their ICS security program, getting involved and looking at ways they can reduce risk on their own, which I think is just so important. Next slide, please. And of course, these are things that should be done regularly, not just a one-time activity, but operationalized into a regular event. Next slide, please. So let's start off by talking about firewall rules. This is something that we often will evaluate during our assessments, and we see a lot of the same findings across industries. What we often see when we take a look at these firewall rules is a lot of unintentional access between the corporate network and the operational network. We'll often see temporary firewall rules. One thing that what we like to say is there's nothing more permanent than a temporary firewall rule. And I think that's certainly true. A lot of these firewall rules are put in place during initial commissioning, during the initial setup of a control system, and there they stay forever until we come along and discover them. Also, Tom Van Norman talked about the importance of isolating your test networks or your ICS lab environments, and that really reminded me of a story that I heard from a customer a few months ago where they had a simulation network that was routable. They could route traffic into their production network. And the worst day they ever had was the day they loaded the wrong program into their lab environment and started sending packets into their production network, which opened up, I think, 87 backwash filters and flooded their basement with about 6 feet of water. So you want to make sure that your lab environments are isolated from your production environments and really understand what's going in and out of your ICS firewall. And it's not that difficult to do. There's a lot of tools you can use. There's commercial tools or free tools that you can use to evaluate most firewall rules. And it's just a matter of going through those rules. You can dump them out of your firewall and then just go line by line, rule by rule. Can we justify this rule? What does it mean? What's it used for? Who's using this? What are the comments in that rule? And you really want to identify those interactive protocols that allow remote access, like SSH or Telnet, remote desktop, even things like SMB or WMI can be used for remote access. So you want to watch for all these things and make sure you can justify or lock down their existence in your firewall rules. Next slide, please. So there's a couple tools you can use. Nipper is one that's a commercial tool that's quite good. The other one that's free is the SolarWinds firewall browser. And you can download this, and most firewalls I've encountered, it's able to read the firewall rules and put the data into a nice tabular format that you can quickly parse through and evaluate those rules. And talk to the people involved, the engineering team, your vendor, to ensure that these rules should exist and are absolutely necessary. So this is what that firewall browser looks like with a set of firewall rules here. You can see there's some interactive protocols there. Next slide, please. So another major issue that we see when we do our assessments is access management. So over the years, we've seen more and more Active Directory get implemented into ICS environments. And Active Directory, it's a wonderful tool for managing users and passwords and really creating some connective and more easier to maintain connections between your OT and IT environment. It really solves a lot of the old problems of shared passwords and weak passwords in the ICS environments that we've seen previously. But the issue we have or we encounter with these Active Directory environments in ICS is they're usually poorly maintained, or almost everybody's a domain admin, or there's many overprivileged accounts. So once somebody gets in there, it's very easy for them to move around and cut through that network. So what we find when we're in the ICS network, we rarely need to use exploits. We rarely need to use anything too technical to move around the network. Usually we're able to just collect credentials. We're able to pull passwords out of memory, find passwords that are laying around the network in shares, and use those passwords to move throughout the network and do what we need to or what we want to in that environment. And we see this from a lot of the adversaries that we track as well, that often exploits aren't necessary. They're able to just move through the environment using the existing credentials and work off the environment, much like the engineering team would. So what can we do about this? You can use a tool called Bloodhound, which is free and open source, to evaluate your Active Directory environment in ICS. It's actually pretty easy to use and very powerful. It uses graph theory to map out the connections and the trusts between your groups and users in your Active Directory environment, so that you can understand where your risks are and how any particular user could go from 0 to hero, from a regular user right up to domain admin. So it's something that adversaries often will use and look for ways to escalate privilege in the Active Directory environment. And it's something that we should be using on our own environments to understand where those risks are and understand where these overprivileged accounts are. And there's other Active Directory enumeration scripts and things that you can use as well that are free and fairly easy to set up. So next slide, please. So here's an example of what Bloodhound looks like. It's very easy to run. You execute it on any one of your machines in that Active Directory environment, and it is able to query all the endpoints from that single position, from that Active Directory server, and get a map of your whole network and the trust relationships between the users and groups. And then visualize that using GraphQL, using graph theory here. So we can see these relationships and kind of unwind that yarn ball that often is created in Active Directory environments. Next slide, please. So another common issue, part 2 of access management, is the credentials we find laying around. And we often see this from the adversaries as well when we're looking at DFIR reports or incident response reports or threat intel feeds. We see adversaries are often dropping a lot of these post-exploitation tools. And a lot of these tools are just grabbing passwords from memory. They're things like Mimikatz, LSAS dumping tools, Mimikittens, the Nursoft suite of tools, Session Gophers, just things to pull passwords from various components, from various tools on the network and on that endpoint. And then using those credentials, they're able to escalate privilege and move laterally in those environments. And this is something we actually incorporated in our level 3, level 4 of the SANS CTF. There's a lot of post-exploitation tools that we see adversaries use, that we used in our scenario as well. So what you need to do is understand how you're storing your credentials, where they're being stored, and how easy it is for an adversary to pull those out of memory. And you can use that, use the same tools that the adversaries are using. So things like Mimikatz are fairly safe to run in your environment. It should set off alarms. It should create some alerts in your environment. So it's good to just kind of test that. And then seeing what you can pull out of memory, how vulnerable you are to that kind of LSAS dumping attack is good to know. And there are ways you can harden your system against and protect against those types of attacks. So it's good to understand how you would be able to detect these tools, what they look like when they're used, and how that exposes you to risk. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a Mimikatz credential hunt. So you don't need to have any software running on your environment to do this type of attack. All you need to do is open up the task manager from an administrator account and then do a dump file of your LSAS. Next slide, please. And from that dump file, you just need to copy that to a computer off your network, a Kali Linux box, or whatever you may have that has Mimikatz. Run the Mimikatz tool and then pass in that LSAS dump and see what it's able to pull, what kind of credentials it's able to pull out of memory. So it's a good exercise to do. You don't need to put any software on your ICS environment. You're able to run that without doing that. Next slide, please. And here's another tool called Session Gopher, which is able to look for a number of different credentials stored by different pieces of software like WinSCP or Windows Remote Desktop, and pull those out of the registry and the hard disk and other places. So you can see what other credentials are being exposed. So this is often one of the first steps an attacker will do once they get onto an endpoint is just grab as many credentials as they can and see where they can use that on the network. Next slide, please. Hardening. Now this is one of the major issues we see across the board where for a number of reasons, hardening hasn't been taking place on Windows endpoints within ICS environments. And this really makes it easy often for adversaries to pull memory, pull passwords out of memory and do man-in-the-middle type attacks and move laterally through the network without much resistance. So just doing a little bit of hardening can go a long way. And we did see there are some tools you can use. One actually written by Don Weber, who presented earlier today from Cutaway Security, which I really love, is called CHAPS. It's a PowerShell tool, configuration hardening assessment PowerShell script, CHAPS. And you can run that. It's designed for ICS endpoints. You can run that on the endpoint, and it'll provide a nice report about ways you could harden the system further. There's other tools available as well, like the Microsoft Security Compliance Toolkit, which is free, the SIS tools and STIG tools, which are more like commercial tools, but still will do a great job identifying ways you can harden your ICS assets. And of course, before you make any changes on these assets, you really want to make sure that it's not going to impact that system, that the vendor is okay with those changes. So there are some complexities around implementing these hardening changes. But you want to make sure that you're not going to introduce any operational risk by doing those. But by implementing these changes, you really make it harder for the adversary to cut through that network. Next slide, please. And I want to give a quick demonstration of what CHAPS looks like. It's just a PowerShell script. You run it there, and then it gives you a nice list of ways you can further lock down your environment. Next slide, please. And it's kind of a pass-fail style view. And it covers a lot of the common hardening issues we see, like WDigest and LLMNR. A lot of these things we see in ICS environments today, really because often the operations team or the engineering team didn't ask the vendor to implement hardening or to implement security as part of their design of the system. So these things never really were turned on. You kind of have to ask for that security to be turned on, or ask that, or add those standards, or dictate what you want as far as security is concerned when you're deploying these projects. Next slide, please. So logging is a very important part of any industrial cybersecurity program. Of course, earlier today, Rob Lee said, when we're building an ICS cybersecurity program, we want to start with incident response and kind of work your way back from there. And centralized logging is an important force multiplier for both incident response and threat hunting activities. And Sergio also mentioned in his presentation that within incident response, we quickly run into walls where there's missing data, where we're having trouble collecting data. And this is where centralized logging, just putting all the logs in one place, can really make it easier, and ensuring you're collecting the right kind of logs. Just the default Windows logging is not going to be very useful for you. Configuring your logging appropriately and centrally managing that is a really important step. Now there's tools like the Windows Event Forwarder that's free, and it's a feature built into Windows that allows you to forward all the Windows events into a central Windows management machine. So that's pretty easy to implement and doesn't cost anything really other than time. But of course, a solution like Splunk would be ideal. Costs a lot more money, but it gives you that visibility and the searchability through those logs. And this is one of those security controls that plays an important role in both detection and response. And again, Don Weber's Cutaway Security tool, the CHAPS, can also provide you information about your logging configuration. It can show you where your gaps are on what you're logging, if you're logging PowerShell, if you're logging WMI events. It makes sure that you have these more advanced logging features turned on, so you can actually capture events that matter. Next slide, please. And here's what that CHAPS output looks like, with some of the Windows logging events there listed as well. If your PowerShell is turned on, what kind of modules are enabled, what the size of those logs, what the rollover looks like. So a lot of these basic checks that you should be doing in your environment can be covered by this script. Next slide, please. Now, network visibility. Here's another critical control. As industrial penetration testers, we're frequently able to operate within these environments undetected and unhindered, as one of the inherent problems we have in this industry is a lack of visibility into our ICS networks. Quite often, Windows logs aren't being collected. They're not centrally monitored or managed. In other cases, we encounter ICS networks that do have centralized collection, but they're logging the wrong kind of data. They're not logging data that's valuable. Sometimes we encounter IT-based solutions that have been deployed in ICS environments that aren't very effective at monitoring them. And these IT technologies are effective at stopping IT attacks, but not really capable of detecting or understanding ICS-specific tradecrafts. Now, JD stated in his presentation that detection is a must. And I agree. It's very important to be able to detect an adversary in your environment and understand what's going on. And he also stated that one of the first steps of creating an ICS cybersecurity program is to identify what matters and what you need to protect. And network visibility can actually help you understand what's in your environment, where those assets are, and that way you can prioritize their protection. Often we still hear that people don't know what's in their environment. They haven't identified all their ICS assets as the plant has evolved over time. So network visibility is another one of those controls that supports both detection and response capabilities in your environment. And what can we do about this? How can we address network visibility? It's good to start off small and just understand what networks you have, understand where you might tap in, where you might install taps, or you might configure span ports to monitor this traffic, even on an ad hoc basis, even if you want to collect a PCAP once in a while just to do some offline analysis. I think that's a really good way of getting rolling. Doesn't cost you much money, doesn't take too much effort, but identifying those hook-in points where you can collect this data is a really good first start. And then creating a procedure around the collection of network captures, or using some tools to evaluate them. Of course, the ultimate solution is to deploy something like the Dragos platform, where you can have that real-time visibility and threat monitoring. But there are other tools you could use just to view the data, like Network Miner or some of the Dragos community tools. Next slide, please. So Dragos has released a few free community tools that you can use to provide visibility and asset identification in these environments. Sophia has been around for a number of years, and that's a very powerful continuous asset identification platform that we purchased and have released free to the community. And then CyberLens is a very old product that Dragos developed several years ago, and then stopped developing to focus on the Dragos platform, which is the big brother of these two products. The code base is completely separate. It's a different product than Sophia and CyberLens. But these two products, using them in combination or just one or the other, can help you get some initial visibility, can help you start to go down that journey and start to build upon your capability for network visibility. Next slide, please. So here's what CyberLens looks like. It's a great way of taking a PCAP, capturing that PCAP, and then rendering it to show the network flows, to show the asset IDs and how they're interconnected, and play through the traffic over time. Next slide, please. And of course, the Dragos platform is another solution. That's our primary product at Dragos. So we've got to talk about that. And it provides more of a holistic approach to network monitoring and threat-based detection and intelligence. And that's it. Next slide. Thank you so much.